So what's going on here? You've seen one day so far, Laura. We've seen world leaders. I mean, politicians are very good at saying a lot of stuff and then going home again. Am I being too cynical here? What did you make of it?
I heard the government and other leaders speaking the words that we've been saying for the last 3 years now, since Extinction Rebellion formed, that this is an existential threat, that this is an emergency, that our kids will never forgive us if we don't act on this. So they are confessing that we are absolutely on the brink, that this is the last best hope to turn things around. And so hearing that kind of communication has changed my spiel, because I was coming up to say those things. And now it's like, okay, we've got to actually act on it and make it happen, because an agreement is nothing without action. And so far, our government certainly have spoken and then constantly contradicted their words with their actions throughout even this last year, leading up to COP that we're hosting, saying, yes, setting impressive targets. They are good targets. But then doing everything that counters what you would need to do to move forward on that. So expanding airports, to hit 27 billion for new roads, Cambo oil field up the road here, flirting with the idea of a coal mine. Like, we've got to start acting on it and not just speaking about acting on it.
But we can have roads, can't we? Because we'll have electric cars, so that's okay.
That's okay. You can have roads, but expanding them at this point is not the way forward, because all the evidence suggests that the more roads there are, the more congestion there will be.
Does the whole thing collapse a little bit, though, Laura, when I made that announcement about India's net zero target 2070, half a century away? I mean, that's not going to, the whole thing will come tumbling down without powerhouses like India and China on board. I know you'll be familiar with these arguments, but you take the point. I mean, surely it's all or nothing, everyone or nothing.
No, absolutely. You're completely right. So all these targets give us a false sense of time. It's not about a date in time. It's about the remaining carbon budget to keep the world below 1.5 degrees, which we're told is approximately 320 billion tonnes of carbon emissions left to emit before we go over that 1.5 critical threshold. Past that point, we've been hearing from developing nations that are literally going to be sunk under sea. They're not going to exist anymore if we go beyond that point. And so, we really need to listen to these scientists, that the amount of time that we have left at current rates of emissions, we're using approximately 40 billion tonnes a year, is gone within 8 years. So these distant timelines are completely irrelevant. It's all about the remaining budget and sharing that equally amongst the countries.
So what's the point then, Laura, where, because I said a second ago, I can remember a few years ago, people saying, we've only got until 2020. After that, it's irreversible. It doesn't matter what we do, you can't tackle it. So where is that number? What is that date now?
Because
it started off in about 1968, that date, didn't it?
Well, absolutely. And we're seeing that already we are in a climate crisis. It's happening now. This summer, we watched the horrific and heartbreaking, catastrophic weather events on every continent of the globe. People died this year. The scientists saying now, nowhere is safe. We've for a long time been saying it's all about the global south. It is much about the global south. They are indeed suffering the worst.
But we've always had bad weather, Laura. But bad weather used to kill people in the millions. It doesn't anymore.
Not apocalyptic floods and fires. I'm watching the news every day, almost weekly at least, and I'm just absolutely horrified by what I'm seeing. It's just like something out of a horror film, not something that's really happening now. And it's such a shame that it needs to actually happen to people, for them actually to be the ones affected, to realise that we have to act on this, and this is real.
Do you think? Sorry to talk over you. I was just. Do you think, in terms of getting these messages out to the public, do politicians miss a trick here? Because most people listening to this are thinking, how am I going to pay my energy bills? How am I going to feed my family? Can I fill the car up? And if I've had such a rough year, can I go on holiday? And you're here, along with others, saying, actually, it's going to be impossible, and rightly so, to do most of those things. And no, you can't go on holiday.
No, I don't agree with that. We're not asking for people to go back to the Stone Ages. The holidays, we can staycation, we can use trains that are using electric energy.
So we can't go on an aeroplane. Is that part of your thinking, that we shouldn't fly?
Currently, with current aviation fuels and aviation as it is, currently with everything, like, we're absolutely at the last point here. So just the UK's remaining carbon budget of this 1.5, our fair share of it will be gone within the next 2.5 to 4 years if we carry on as we are. you know, when you let that sink in, you realise that we need to make some fundamental, massive changes.
You think we can turn around?
It should be, just to answer your question about, you know, our lifestyles and things, really what we should do is put carbon-intensive movements, you know, cruise ships and aviation luxury activities on pause whilst the technologies catch up to enable those things to happen in a really green.
So no foreign holidays for a decade, maybe. No Tenerife, no Spain. I mean, that's going to collapse an economy, isn't it?
Incredible. We're so clever. Well, that's the thing. So we all keep hearing about the economy. Of course, that's an important thing in the way that we're set up. But we've seen through the COVID crisis that the impossible is possible, that money can be found when it's necessary.
What does the
world...
world...
People are okay to make incredibly huge sacrifices if they understand that it will help to safeguard the people that they love and they understand the risks to themselves. So, you know, the changes that we would need to make to the climate crisis and the environmental crisis as well, we mustn't forget our environment is in a dire straits too, would be nothing as severe as what we went through for COVID.
But if you look at, I think what's confusing some people on this one, Laura, is that if you look at what, you know, the various climate reports say, they often point to the very worst case scenario, and even there they say it's not likely to happen. So are you guys being over apocalyptic in your predictions here?
No, well, at 1.5 degrees, we've heard from developing nations, they're going to be underwater, they're going to lose their entire countries. At 1.5 degrees of global overheating, 75% of the coral reefs are predicted to be dead. At 2 degrees, 99% gone. Like, this is going to happen.
So when would that happen? What's the year then that's predicted, Laura, that will happen if we did nothing from now?
If we carry on as we are, the carbon budget will be used up within the next 8 years. The temperature may take longer to actually get up to that figure. But the best case scenario on the IPCC's 6th report says that it will go over 1.5, but then we draw it back down later in the end of the century. So 2040 is the date that I've heard. I'm not, you know, I studied science at university. I'm an Olympic sailor. I spent my life.
Oh no, I'm not excited. Listen, I'm not. There's no gotcha moment here. I'm not expecting you have an answer to everything. But obviously, if you are talking, you know, about a fairly miserable future if we don't act, it's right to know a little bit more detail about that. You're putting your name to Extinction Rebellion, and lots of people scratch their head and think, well, really, is there the end of the world suddenly out of nowhere? It's the end of the world. What's going on here?
Well, completely. That was what I was asking too when I found this out, and it was only the beginning of January 2019 that I came to learn that we were in this terrible crisis. And since then, I've focused everything I can on the problems and also the solutions, starting off with all the eco-swaps at home. And I think that we need to shift the focus away from the fear. That we need to fear, we need to understand how bad this is. We need to grieve it, we need to feel it, we need to feel that pain, because that will motivate us to act and to change and to make the necessary
I think that's an interesting point about feeling the pain that you feel. Stay there, Laura. Don't disappear. We've got to take a pause for some news. We're going to come back as well and hear from Ben Harris-Quinney. I'm sure Ben has very differing views on those predictions from what you've heard from Laura. We'll get his take on it, and we might bounce back and hear Laura's response to him as well. If you're hanging on the phones, Derek, Andrew, Chris, Neil, Tony and others, we're pretty rammed on this one. The question to throw out at the beginning, are you more convinced about a climate emergency? You heard the world leaders yesterday. You've just heard Laura there. She's a former Olympic sailor, and she's, in addition to that, a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. What do you make of what you've just heard? 0344 499 1000. Person for Extinction Rebellion. I mean, just to address that first point, Laura, I mean, Ben's onto something there. I touched on it with our chat earlier that, I mean, we have had lots of predictions back to the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. Ben mentioned Al Gore there. A lot of doomsday scenarios that simply never happened. Why is this one different?
It is happening. You just look at your news this summer, and the scientists are saying that actually these floods, fires, wild, heat waves are happening 70 years, decades ahead of when they were predicted to happen. That the models were actually slower than they are going quicker, and the models were slower than they were predicting. So actually it's worse than was predicted.
Ben, can you
so there's that point. The second point...
Just respond to that, Ben, if you could.
My best friend lives in New York. I spoke to her last night. by all accounts, I'm sure she would have mentioned if she was underwater, which is what Al Gore predicted by this time New York will be underwater and the Arctic is ice-free. So not only have these predictions proven to be total nonsense, the idea that they're happening faster than predicted is just complete nonsense.
And Laura,
Again,
that is the issue, though, Laura, isn't it? That it's very hard when, you know, what Ben says there is quite compelling, even if you do have an answer to that, and that's the message people take from this, isn't it? You know, what happened to the Al Gore prediction of doom?
It's important that they don't take that message, because that's distracting from the fact that many of the predictions are happening way quicker than.
But they didn't happen.
Expected.
That's Ben's point.
Well,
they demonstrably didn't happen.
The one thing I learned from being an Olympic sailor is it's very, very difficult to predict the weather. And we're dealing with unknowns. It's scientists doing their best job to try and predict things. And they're warning us with no doubt that we are facing a code red for humanity, that we must act now on this. So we need to not be discussing, is it happening, should we act on it? We absolutely must act on it.
Okay,
we need to take the precautionary principle and keep ourselves safe. It says if there's a risk of something happening, then we should act to ensure that that risk doesn't.
So there, it's not. We don't get two goes at this, Ben. So we might as well go for it. If there's a risk there, and those predictions, you know, not necessarily 100%, but they are there, and we can now see with extreme weather conditions, burning fires, floods in Germany, Italy, and all the rest of it, that these things are, in fact, coming to fruition.
Well, actually, again, I encourage people to look at the truth and the facts rather than these extraordinary scenarios that are presented. If you look at the facts, deaths due to the climate, due to environmental phenomena were 10 times higher in 1920, and the global population was obviously far less in 1920. So the idea that, oh, the world's on fire, everyone's dying, again, it's total nonsense. So I really would encourage the Green lobby, who I think, you know, have got some good points, if they would just focus on what is going on domestically, if they'd focus on stopping the government building all over the Green Belt, if they'd focus on stopping mass immigration, which is driving 80% of the population increase in the United Kingdom, there'd actually be a lot of common ground that I think most of the country could agree on. But by making these apocalyptic scenarios that anyone is now able to research and see that they prove time and time again to be false, as I keep saying, they are making a rod for their own backs. And it's no good saying, oh, well, people shouldn't listen to that, people should ignore it. Okay. That is the truth. If you're telling people to ignore the truth, you've got a big problem with your debate.
And Laura, let me just put another point to you that Ben raised, and that is, you know, behind the mask of Extinction Rebellion is a cartel of socialists and communists who actually want to change the world in different ways, and they've simply found a mechanism and a platform to do that. The ultimate enemy, if you like. The left loves an enemy. It exists only when there's someone to shout at. And you guys have found it perfectly. But if we remove the mask of XR, what's under there is essentially a Marxist organisation. They've got other ideas about how humans should live. True or false?
No, absolutely false. No. The climate crisis doesn't care about your political orientation. Extinction Rebellion don't care about your political orientation. We welcome everybody. We all face this together. And we know that everybody has differing opinions. So our solution to it, we haven't stepped, as a movement, has not said that you can't fly, you can't eat meat. We don't come forward and say the solutions to the problem. Our demand is for a citizens' assembly to bring ordinary people, everybody representing the demographic together to discuss what the best solutions are.
That's quite Marxist-like, isn't it? I don't use that as a pejorative, but this idea of this kind of community, you know, people deciding, it's got a sort of vague Orwellian thing to that. You end up with chaos, don't you? We've already got elected individuals, whether it's in local councils or in Westminster. We already do that.
And unfortunately, you know, they are lobbied and they have self-interest. And they're just representing themselves really, and their agendas, and they're all, the majority of them are part of an elite, you know, upper class group of people. A citizens' assembly would enable
I don't think the majority
every
of them
demographic of the population to come together. It's democracy.
I think
all right, final word, Ben.
If you want to see an elite, okay, that are imposing their views on the world and on domestic populations, look at COP26. Look at the people streaming in with 85-car motorcades and private jets. There's your elite, okay? So this idea that the people pushing this stuff are in some way an underclass is the complete opposite of the truth. I would actually agree with Extinction Rebellion if what they're proposing is a public referendum. I think what needs to happen is the government needs to publish the costs and restrictions that are going to be necessary if they bring forward these measures. And because it will be the most expensive policy, perhaps the most consequential policy in British history, I think we should have a referendum on it, and we'll see what the public say.
You can't put a price on people's lives, though. You're asking, we can't afford to do this. We can't afford not to do it.
But it would be good, Laura, wouldn't it? It'd be good to have, if everything,
if
people, you're saying people are going to die, then we would need the evidence for that and need things costed out.
Germany, China, Canada, every continent of the globe, people died this year. It's happening. But we need to not focus on that. We need to look at the solution and make it something that is going to be that everybody wants. Given the choice of life or death.
Okay, I know. All right. I think both of you have had a good chomp at the apple on this one. Thank you, Laura Baldwin, spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. Ben Harris-Quinney with a slightly different view, although with sympathies for wider environmental arguments, chairman of the Bow Group.